We have Professor Monte Johnson here from the University of California, San Diego. He's an expert in ancient Greek philosophy, among other things, author of many works, many articles, reviews, and including a book on Aristotle, on Aristotle's teleology. He's going to talk to us today about one of Aristotle's missing dialogues, the Protrepticus, and he'll explain what all that kind of language even means and what it means to have a missing dialogue and how to reconstruct it, but also about the philosophy inside it. So please join me in welcoming Professor Johnson.
Well, thank you so much, and let me begin by thanking David, Professor Jennings, and Hicks for arranging this talk, and also to Jennifer Casillas, who really helped me organize the travel here, and I challenged her several ways, so I really appreciate it. And all of you for actually coming here on a Friday afternoon to hear a talk about stodgy old Aristotle. I really appreciate that. And the main thing I want to do is actually get this into your hands. And what this is, you are some of the only people that have this because it hasn't been published yet. And it's an attempt to reconstruct a lost work of Aristotle. And yes, I'll explain what lost work means, but I've given you a translation into English of a reconstruction of this lost work. I'm actually cooperating with a professor of mine, a mentor of mine named Doug Hutchinson. We've been working on this project together, and our plan is to produce a critical Greek edition with a translation and a commentary on the whole work, in which case it will be sort of back in the Aristotle corpus. In the meantime, it's what we call a lost work. And by that, I mean that the work isn't included in what we call the Aristotle corpus, so the body of Aristotle's works. That's the corpus that includes the famous works like the physics, the politics, the rhetoric, the poetics, parts of animals, categories, all of those, which are based actually on medieval manuscripts. They go back to like the 12th century AD. We gather those together, and those are sort of the surviving works of Aristotle. So what are the lost works? They're all the other works of Aristotle that he wrote, but that weren't continuously copied since antiquity, and so didn't make it into these medieval manuscripts that themselves were copied until the age of printing in the Renaissance, when we started getting printed editions. And now, of course, we have internet editions. And so, until there's a nuclear war or something, we should be able to keep the works of Aristotle alive. But in this process of transmission, many of his works were lost. One way that we know that is because there are ancient lists of his writings. And the title of this work, the Protrepticus, which means something like the exhortation. Well, that's just to give a Latin translation of a Greek term. So it actually means something like the invitation or introduction, the encouragement, literally something that's meant to turn you towards doing philosophy, turn you on to doing philosophy, get you to want to do philosophy instead of something else that you might be doing on a Friday night, get you to show up here and do some philosophy. This title appears on all of the ancient lists we have of Aristotle's writings. Here's the beginning of one of those lists. It gives us 15 titles. Every work on this part of this list is missing or lost, meaning it wasn't copied. Okay? And there are some interesting things about this list. So we know that the work on justice was a dialogue. A dialogue is a work in which a philosopher just doesn't do like Descartes or something and tell you, hey, this is how it is. It's where you have characters who have names and they're in some kind of dramatic setting, and it characterizes a conversation about philosophy that they have. the kind of stuff that Socrates did. Socrates didn't write anything. We think of him as sort of the founder of Greek philosophy or something, but his idea of philosophy was getting together with a couple of your friends and debating about the nature of virtues. And Plato's works are all dialogues of this form. Now, Aristotle also wrote dialogues, we're told by people in antiquity, but none of them have survived. The only things that have survived by Aristotle are these treatises like the Physics, the Politics, and so forth. But again, on these lists, we have titles of other works that we're pretty sure, or we know for certain, are dialogues. The 15th one, On Noble Birth, that's the translation of a title which basically means on eugenics. But on Noble Birth, we actually have fragments of this that show speaker exchanges. Somebody, like in works of Plato, you might have read where Socrates says, isn't a virtue like this? Isn't justice like this? Yes, it is, Socrates, says the respondent. Well, then, wouldn't this be an example of it? Yes, it would, Socrates. So we actually have fragments of Aristotle writing dialogues like that. And you see, I put 5 titles here in red. One of them is the Protrepticus, the work I'm going to be talking about, the 12th work on that list. The other ones in red are exact same titles of dialogues also written by Plato. So Statesman, Sophist, Menexenus, and Symposium. Plato wrote dialogues with those titles. So this would be like if one of you were to take Professor Jennings' class and to write a book called Attention or something, okay? And like that, you may talk to her about it or you might not, she may approve of it or not, but you write your own work that's equivalent to what she wrote. Aristotle evidently did that, okay? Now, Plato did not write a work called Protrepticus, so this seems to have been an original work of Aristotle, but he wrote it at a time when Aristotle was a pupil in Plato's academy. So Plato was a pupil of Socrates, Aristotle was a pupil of Plato's, and during the time that Aristotle was a pupil in Plato's school, there were some attacks made on the way that he was teaching philosophy in the academy. And this work by Aristotle is a defense of the kind of philosophy, a very mathematical, theoretical kind of philosophy that they were doing in the academy at the time. And so one interesting thing about it is that it's a defense of an attack on philosophy, because at the time people were saying the way you're doing philosophy is worthless and people should be going on to law school instead, or business school, or something that actually is effective and shouldn't be wasting their time on philosophy. Of course, we no longer have anybody saying stuff like that anymore, right? But that's actually one of the things that makes this so interesting, is that it turns out that all of the arguments against philosophy that we hear nowadays from your parents and counselors and things like that, all of those were already being made in antiquity, and all of them were already having to be answered. And I'll show you some of that as we go through. Now, so here's the kinds of evidence we have for this lost work. First, the appearance on the ancient lists that I just mentioned. Second, we have 6 reports in commentators on Aristotle about a specific argument that I'm going to tell you more about later, called the self-refutation argument. Then we have 3 fragments of papyrus. These are literally ancient books that were found in the desert in Egypt, buried in a trash heap in Egypt, that archaeologists uncovered, found this papyrus, it had writing on it, and we have reasons to think that the writing on these 3 scraps of paper were attributable to this work, the Protrepticus. The vast majority of what's in here, in this reconstruction, are translation of about 1,000 lines of verbatim quotation from 2 different works of an extremely obscure late ancient philosopher named Iamblichus of Chalcis. Okay? I'll say a lot more about him in due course. Now, only the papyrus fragments and the verbatim quotations appearing in this later author are literally fragments that we can use to reconstruct the work. Everything else is a report of somebody talking about it that may or may not have been what he actually said. And this includes remarks of Aristotle's own, because Aristotle himself gives an account of protreptic rhetoric as one of the kinds of deliberative rhetoric in his work on rhetoric. And what we find is that the arguments contained in the Reconstruction correspond to Aristotle's advice about how you should write a protreptic speech. And what's interesting is that we're pretty sure, we know this work is earlier than the rhetoric. And so what happened is that he didn't write up a list of recommendations about how to do protreptic speech and then write a protreptic speech based on it. Instead, he first wrote a protreptic speech, and then he gave canons of how to make generic protreptic arguments on the basis of a work he'd already written. He also clearly adapted this work, which was a very popular work. He adapted it in other works of his own. So the famous Beginning of the Metaphysics, which begins, all humans by nature desire to know, and so forth. All of that had been argued earlier. And of course, in the beginnings of a lot of treatises, when he's encouraging the reader, you should keep reading on because you should want to do this, like in the beginning of his Parts of Animals, where he's presenting the first systematic account of biology, and he's explaining why you should be interested in doing biology. Well, he reached back to his earlier generic work about why you should want to do philosophy and adapted those to the specific case of biology. And we also find that he auto-adapted the work in his ethical works, the Eudemian Ethics and the Nicomachean Ethics. Also, other authors in both Greek and Latin adapted his work. So Cicero wrote a work in Latin called the Hortensius that we're told was modeled on Aristotle's Protrepticus. Unfortunately, it's also lost, so we can't really use it as a basis to reconstruct this. But if this reconstruction works, then we will have a much more solid basis for reconstructing the work of Cicero. Cicero gave a defense of academic philosophy. He was an academic philosopher, and he gives a defense of it against attacks coming from a rhetorically oriented, the best rhetorician of his day, this guy named Hortensius. There are also references to the work and quotes of some of its arguments in later other obscure philosophers like Proclus. And then there's a report in a very late source, 5th century AD, about the early 4th century BC reception of the work. And I'll just show you that for a second. So this is in a 5th century AD author. So what is that? That's 1,500 years ago, writing about something that's basically quoting something, describing an event that happened about 1,000 years earlier. And the report tells us that Zeno of Citium, that is the founder of the school of Stoicism, this school that is so popular even nowadays. The founder of Stoicism said that Crates, he's an important Cynic philosopher who was married to a female Cynic philosopher named Hipparchia. Crates, while sitting in a shoe shop, read this work, the Protrepticus of Aristotle, and we're told that Aristotle dedicated the work to Themisson, who is supposed to be some kind of king on the island of Cyprus. Okay, so that is extremely interesting information about how popular and significant the work was, that a founder of another school tells us that another earlier philosopher from another school was reading the work aloud in public. Now, the Iamblichus evidence is the entire basis of reconstructing the work. He lived about 245 to 345, around that 100-year period AD, and he compiled a set of textbooks on Pythagorean philosophy. And he invented chapters and giving chapter titles. This is the first time this ever happened in a work of philosophy, to devise chapter titles. And he designed each of his chapters to serve as a container of excerpts from earlier philosophers. And it just so happened he wrote one of his textbooks he named after Aristotle's work called the Protrepticus to Philosophy. This is a surviving work, 21 chapters. And chapters 5 to 12 are based on quotes from Aristotle's Protrepticus. And that was realized already in 1869, or speculated about in 1869 by Ingram Bywater, and proven authentically by us in an article in 2005. Now, there are also essentially the equivalent amount of material in another work by Iamblichus of Chalcis, which was also constructed in a similar way, chapters and chapter titles that serve as vehicles for quoting earlier philosophers. And in chapters 21 to 27 of that work, we argue, are also based on Aristotle's Protrepticus, and so we have integrated them into this reconstruction. Now, we did this study, published a study in 2005 in Oxford Studies in Ancient Philosophy, a 103-page study of the excerpts from Iamblichus's Protrepticus to Philosophy. And here's the conclusions we came to. First, Iamblichus used very good manuscripts of the works he was quoting, like from Plato, because several of his chapters contained excerpts of Platonic works, and since we have Plato's works, we can see how he quoted from them. Iamblichus's readings are often preferred as being better readings than any of our modern manuscripts, which makes sense because they were more than 1,000 years earlier than our manuscripts, so they were closer to the original source. Second, he always excerpts from only one work at a time, and he doesn't return to a work once he's put it down. He moves unidirectionally through a work, so the order of his excerpts corresponds to the order they are in the original work. Also, he does leave gaps between excerpts of various lengths. So again, we can see when he's quoting, for example, from Plato's Republic or Plato's Gorgias, that he doesn't quote all of it, he quotes some of it, and then he leaves gaps and skips over the material he doesn't want. But whenever he does that, he provides transitional comments which indicate where there's a gap in the source text. And finally, he doesn't modify his texts in any way, except with one important exception. He surgically removes dialogue. So when Plato is writing about Socrates saying, "Isn't this the nature of justice?" and then the interlocutor responds, "Yes, Socrates, it is," Iamblichus will take out the part where the interlocutor says, "Yes, Socrates, it is," and just stitch together the lines of argument, and so convert the dialogue form into a monologue form. But since that's the only modification he makes, we can employ a sort of negative method of authenticating the material. All we have to do is identify his transitional comments, which are easy to do because they're written so long after the source material, and we remove those. We don't have to go line by line and say, is this part of the source text? We just remove the later cover text, and what remains is the source text. So here is the basis of the reconstruction. 3 pieces of papyrus, it's a very small quantity of material. One of them had already been attributed to Aristotle's Protrepticus in the 19th century. 2 of them are new pieces that we attribute to the work. And then the verbatim excerpts from Iamblichus from that work on the Common Mathematical Sciences, or DCMS, chapters 21 to 27. Those are entirely newly attributed to the Protrepticus by us, with the exception of one small bit in chapter 26. And the material in Protrepticus 5 to 12 of Iamblichus, which was first attributed to Aristotle's Protrepticus by an English scholar in 1877. Or was it 1869? That might be a mistake. Now, in the longer reconstruction of the work, we also include all the reports about it and all of the reception of it and the parallels in Aristotle's corpus, but I haven't inflicted all of that on you thinking that 50 pages would be enough of a handout for today. Okay, so here's the idea behind the reconstruction. I mean, all of that is just kind of tedious philological material, and we're going to get into the work and actually look at the philosophical arguments very soon. And here is the idea. There were at least four speakers in the dialogue. One of them, we don't know the name of this person. He's an anti-philosopher. He delivers not a protreptic, but an apotreptic, some kind of dissuasion speech against philosophy. The second, Isocrates of Athens, he offers a qualified defense of practical philosophy. The third, a character named Heraclides of Pontus, who offers a defense of theoretical, mathematical, and kind of esoteric philosophy. And then finally, Aristotle of Stagira. The author made himself a character in his own work, which is an innovation. Plato never makes himself a character in his own work, but we're told that Aristotle innovated the dialogue format by making himself a character, and of course he gives himself the winning part in the dialogue, right? He shows up everybody else and gives the best speeches to his own character. And he offers a kind of synthesis of the Isocratean and Heraclitean approaches to practical and theoretical philosophy. Now, I'll say a little bit more about each of these characters. First, Isocrates of Athens, not to be confused with Socrates of Athens. Okay, this is Isocrates of Athens. He's the guy that founded a renowned school of philosophy 20 years before Plato set up his school of philosophy called the Academy. He had a rhetorical and utilitarian approach to philosophy, and he wrote a work called the Antithesis, which was published in 353 BC, in which he criticized academic philosophy for its excessive focus on theoretical and mathematical activities instead of practical ones like rhetoric, law, business, military affairs, and so forth. And in the Protrepticus, Aristotle puts words in his mouth to make him present his case for his strictly rhetorical and practical philosophy. Then Heraclides of Pontus, not to be confused with the more famous Heraclitus of Ephesus. Okay? This is another member of Plato's Academy, so he was like a fellow student with Aristotle in Plato's Academy. He was an author and innovator of dialogues. He also wrote dialogues like Plato and Aristotle did. He's a great enthusiast and advocate of Pythagorean philosophy. He actually made a permanent contribution to science. He's the one that proposed that the Earth rotates on its axis from west to east every 24 hours. Okay, and that theory, I think we still believe that, and it was advanced by him back then. In the Protrepticus, he's made to argue for an extremely theoretical and esoteric and even pessimistic approach and justification for philosophy. Finally, the character, as opposed to the author, Aristotle of Stagira, he was a member of Plato's Academy when he wrote the work. In the Protrepticus, he presents a synthesis of reasons why one should do both practical and theoretical philosophy. And in fact, he conceives of this distinction that now just seems like the air we breathe, but the distinction between theory and practice is introduced by Aristotle in this very work. He offers a middle way between the extremely practical and the extremely impractical views of Heraclides, but he joins with them in refuting this anti-philosophy speaker. Okay, now those are the characters in it, and here's an outline of what happens in the work. So first there are some opening speeches, then there's a debate about the significance of Pythagoreanism and mathematical philosophy. Then there's Isocrates' critique of theoretical philosophy, and then a defense offered of it by the character Aristotle. Then the character Heraclides gives us several kind of pessimistic arguments for doing theoretical philosophy, and then Aristotle gives a set of arguments, other reasons to do philosophy, what I call a teleological argument, an anti-utilitarian argument, and a political science argument in favor of doing theoretical philosophy. And then there are some final closing arguments about the intrinsic value of doing philosophy. So in this reconstruction, when you get past the title pages, we have some front matter that explains what this is and how you can cite it if you want to use it in your class to annoy my colleague David Jennings or something. This will tell you how to responsibly cite it and how to use it, and reviews some of this information I've been giving you at a too rapid rate about the speakers and the dialogue and that sort of thing. Then those are numbered with Roman numerals. Then with Arabic numerals, we start the actual reconstruction. So when I say page 1, I mean this page, and page 2 is the one that has all that bold on the bottom. Okay? And so now the rest of the talk, I'm basically going to feature some of this and read out some of our translations of this so you can get an idea about the style of the work and also some of the most important content in the work. So in the opening of the work, we have arguments coming from the characters of Isocrates and Heraclides that basically claim that philosophy is valuable because it's practically useful, that it enables us to make use of instrumental goods like wealth and health and that sort of thing. After this, we have the anti-philosophy speech by the anonymous character, and I want to read that out to you, and it's on page 4. So if you turn to page 4, the bold material says this. And remember, this is a papyrus, so the reason there's all these dots is because it's a torn piece of paper that we only can read these bits of it. Okay? And here's our translation. But they don't agree at all on that. No, even silver. And yet what could be whiter than silver? No, despite this, Thrasielkes says it's black. So then, when even the whiteness of silver is on the doubtful side, why be amazed if people who are deliberating have their disagreements over war and peace, over alliances and revenues and disbursements and the like? And what about the philosophers themselves? If you confine them together in the same house and an equal number of madmen in another house next door, you would get much, much greater screaming from the philosophers than from the madmen. In fact, this Antisthenes here, he says he'd rather feel madness than pleasure. And Aristippus, and now it starts breaking up, what is mad? And then we have the tantalizing, and what about Plato? And then it's torn and it's gone. Now, Antisthenes had the view that pleasure is the worst thing in the world and you should avoid it at all costs. Aristippus was a philosopher who had the view that pleasure is the only thing that matters and everything you should do should be immediately pursuing pleasure. And so that's an example of philosophers totally disagreeing and making contradictory arguments. Some of them argue absurd things like snow is black, that Gorgias argued 3 theses. 1, nothing exists. 2nd, even if something existed, you couldn't know anything about it. And 3rd, even if something existed and you could know something about it, you couldn't communicate anything about it to anyone. Okay? And then other people say, you can't even talk about non-existence, only being exists. There's only exactly one thing in the entire universe, and it doesn't change or move in any way. And other people say, no, there's a plurality of things, and it's in constant flux and constantly changing. And so the complaint here is that philosophers can't ever get their story right. They just disagree with each other constantly. Now, to this argument, against this anti-philosophy speech, our reports tell us about, we don't have a fragment of it, but we have reports about a self-refutation argument that we can put together as a kind of declarative argument like this. Either you argue that you should do philosophy or you argue that you shouldn't do philosophy. But if you argue that you should do philosophy, then there you go. You should do philosophy. But if you argue that you shouldn't do philosophy, you're still doing philosophy, thus showing that you should do philosophy. So in any event, you should do philosophy. See, the problem with this anti-philosophy speech here is that it's a piece of philosophy. It's a kind of demonstration you shouldn't do philosophy, but philosophy is the mother of all demonstration. So the person is contradicting themselves, this sort of performative contradiction. Now, I suppose that the work could have ended there, except even Aristotle didn't consider that a decisive argument exactly, and gives a sort of avalanche of further arguments for why you should do philosophy, but that's sort of how the work begins. After that, Aristotle explains why, gives you a real reason you should do philosophy, because it's intrinsically valuable, just like sight is. We enjoy seeing things even if we don't do anything with the sight. That's why we go to the movies. That's why we watch sunsets and so forth, not because we get anything else out of doing it other than the enjoyment of doing it, and philosophy is like that. Now after that, we get an argument, a tremendous set of arguments by the Heraclides character that argues that actually philosophy is valuable because it's transformative. It'll change your life. In fact, it'll change your life so much that you'll become like a god if you do philosophy. Okay, so let's look at some of those arguments. So this will be on page 6 in the bolded material. I'll just excerpt some of it for you. When sensation and intellect are taken away, a human becomes roughly the same as a plant. When intellect alone is taken away, he turns into a beast. When irrationality is taken away, but he remains in his intellect, a human becomes like a god. So one should subdue to one's ability the passions of the irrationality of the soul, and one should employ the pure activities of the intellect and glimpses into oneself as well as the divine, and one should practice living by the roots of the intellect, fixing all the eye of our attention and our passionate love onto that. And I love that because it reminds me of Carolyn Jennings' work on self-control and attention, that you should cultivate self-control so that you can attend exactly to this material, something that is divine and so will make you like a god. For surely one should not observe the things that pertain to God and the divine for the sake of practical action, for they claim it's not righteous to sully the spectacle of the divine by enslaving it to a necessity of what is useful for humans, nor generally should the intellect be glad on account of the needs. And then we have a couple lines of text missing. Probably for them, indeed, it is the only ability of all those we have that lands on target. On the contrary, one should organize one's actions as well as everything else with a view to intellect and God. And it is from this, too, that the measure should be taken of what is reasonable in our particular duties. And then there's a gap in the material, and when we resume the quotation, animals, too, have small glimmers of reason and intelligence, but they have absolutely no share of theoretical wisdom, and this is shared only with the gods, just as humans are actually left behind many animals in the accuracy and strength of their senses and their drives, and this is the only really good thing that cannot be taken away, which they concede is contained in the conception of the good in accordance with the way of life of a virtuous man who is not at all subdued by the things that are contingent and who most of all frees himself from everything in the grip of luck. That is also why there is confidence in the way that he perseveres in his life on the basis of his whole purpose. For what can anyone take away from someone who has for a long time alienated himself from such goods as can be taken away, who really has what is his own, and who lives among what is his own, and is nourished by what is his own, and is connected to the measureless felicity of a God? Okay, so that's the kind of over-the-top rhetoric. Do philosophy, and you don't see this argued much by your professors anymore, right? Hey, make a poster for advertising becoming a philosophy major, and it says, become like God. Okay, not like, here's the jobs you can get afterwards. It's like forget about practical activities. Okay, so Aristotle has a more kind of conservative approach to this, but he integrates in the voice of this other character, this even more extreme view. Okay, then we have several pages of an interesting debate about the significance of Pythagorean philosophy. Pythagoras, you all know about, we attribute the Pythagorean theorem to him, even though it was known thousands of years earlier by Babylonians. We honorifically call that theorem the Pythagorean theorem because he was a great mathematical, theoretical, inspirational philosopher. And Heraclides and the Aristotle character argue about the nature and significance of Pythagorean philosophy. We're told that he learned his mathematics from foreigners and from Thales, but he transformed mathematics not into just a method of computation or something, but into a philosophy and a whole way of life. But we have to reconstruct this philosophy from small glimmers of his original teachings. And Heraclides actually describes this. This is ancient philosophy, which is calling other philosophy ancient philosophy, that is only survives in fragments and so has to be gathered and reconstructed in its significance, exactly the situation we're in with Aristotle's own text. Then there's an argument that says Pythagorean philosophy has real positive ethical and economic effects. And I want to read you that passage on page 9. In the soul, mathematics contributes to purity of cognition and subtlety in our thoughts, as well as to accuracy in its reasoning and contact with our own incorporeal substances, as well as due proportion and even temper and conversion to reality. And in the human person, it provides order in our way of life, as well as rest from the passions and beauty in character traits, as well as discoveries of the other things that are beneficial to the human way of life. And they turned their hands to philosophy throughout the whole of their domestic life, weaving the profit from it into their actions and their habits of mind, as well as into the construction of their cities and into the management of their private homes, as well as of skilled manufacturing and preparations for war or peace. And generally, they applied mathematical science in all of the parts of their way of life, appropriately for business affairs, beneficially for those who use it, harmoniously in both of these domains, and proportionally in all others. So you can see how that argument answers the apotreptic anti-philosophy speech that said philosophers are terrible because they just create disagreements, and so they'll create disagreements over war and peace, alliances, revenues, disbursements, things like that. And this argument says no, they can actually create a kind of agreement by using mathematical arguments. They can create more agreement and clarity in these areas of extreme disagreement. Now, Aristotle has a slightly different interpretation of the significance of this philosophy, and he argues that the real reason Pythagoras pursued mathematics is the beauty of its objects and the precision of the knowledge that it enabled in astronomy, harmonics or music, optics, and cosmology. But he also argues that because mathematics uses demonstrations or proofs, that mathematics creates more agreement than disagreement, and that's in a passage on page 13. And I want to read that one to you as well. It's the second bolded passage on 13. Because the Pythagoreans occupied themselves with mathematics and appreciated the accuracy of its accounts, because it is the only thing that humans deal with that has demonstrations or proofs, and because equal agreement is reached by using numbers in harmonics and in the mathematics concerning sight by using diagrams, for all these reasons they thought that these things are causes of what exists and are their first principles. Hence, someone who wishes to observe the things that exist as they are has to look at them, the numbers and the geometrical forms and ratios of what exists, because everything is clarified using them. Now, since they didn't think it either more opportune or more worthwhile to attach themselves to the powers of each of them than to the cause of the whole, the Pythagoreans defined the others in these terms as well in pretty much the same way. And I love that because emphasizing the importance of using diagrams and proofs, this is something that Professor Yoshimi also talks about in his work on visualizing complex processes through diagrammatic reasoning, and this is one of the earliest explanations and justifications for that. Actually, in Aristotle's work, Meteorology, we have the oldest preserved example of a lettered geometrical diagram. Okay, the next part, and this is really the central controversy in the whole work, is the critique of this theoretical mathematical philosophy that we've just been defending by the character Isocrates. And this is the passage on page 14 to 15 that I'll just excerpt for you. It's the one that begins, if their end result is useless, the point for which the philosophers say they should be learned, it will necessarily be much more pointless to put effort into them. Okay, Isocrates' argument is that everything that is good and beneficial for the life of humans consists in being used and put into action and not mere knowledge. And he gives several examples of this. For example, in medicine, we don't just want to know the causes of health and disease. We want to become healthy and avoid disease. And we don't want to theoretically they do in business school, just know the causes of wealth and becoming wealthy. The real reason all those people go to business school is because they think it'll make them wealthy, right? And in general, we don't just want to know the causes of the good life or the ethical life. We actually want to live the good life and be ethical. Okay, so that's a pretty good point with reference to those examples. And he argues that those who pursue merely theoretical sciences actually do worse at these important practical things than those who just focus on the practical aspects. And he makes that argument with reference to 6 other sciences, which he makes a pairwise comparison between them. So he says that land surveying is a great thing, and it enables us to measure out real estate and that sort of thing. Geometry, not so much. All this, going into is the interior angles of a triangle equal to the sum of 2 right angles and so forth. That's kind of a waste of time, but you can get all of that done, all you need, with some practical land surveying. Also, musical performance, okay? Do the musicians we admire spend a lot of time studying the theories of harmonics and acoustics? Would Jimmy Page be a better musician if he had done that instead of, practicing playing the guitar and actually playing it in concerts? Of course not. He would have been a much worse musician, and then we wouldn't have had all this wonderful music. And another example, navigation. Navigational astronomy, like measuring the stars for the sake of sailing your ship, or nowadays driving your car, that's very worthwhile and very practical and useful, but we don't need to go into the details about cosmology and astronomy in order to make use of those. In fact, we would waste our times doing that. So he concludes this speech on page 15. For practical activities, sciences like this will be entirely useless, and if among activities they miss out on the correct ones, then the love of learning misses out on the greatest of goods. So that is an attack on this theoretical mathematical philosophy. The rest of the work is an attempt to defend philosophy against that very attack. And I'll just summarize many of the arguments for you. First, Aristotle comes in with the defense of theoretical mathematical philosophy along the following lines. First, he argues that only by doing theoretical philosophy will we be enabled to make use of instrumental goods and instrumental knowledge correctly, because theoretical philosophy is actually a kind of directive and commanding discipline. Second, he argues, look, theoretical philosophy is actually possible, useful, and itself worthwhile. And in this context, in the passage on page 16 to 17, especially on 17, Aristotle gives a definition of philosophy, and this is the only work of all works of Aristotle that we have that he actually gives a definition of philosophy. And so in the second paragraph there, this is on 17, he says, "So one ought not to flee from philosophy, if indeed philosophy is, just as we think, both a possession and a use of wisdom. And wisdom is among the greatest of goods. And one ought not, for the sake of wealth, to sail to the pillars of Hercules and often take risks while not laboring at all, or spending anything on account of intelligence. Yet isn't it really servile to cling to living rather than to living well, and to follow the opinions of the majority rather than to expect the majority to follow one's own, and to search for money but not show any concern whatsoever for things that are beautiful?" And then he gives an argument on page 17 and 18 about the development of philosophy, how theoretical mathematical philosophy is sort of the most recent development to come along. All the other arts like agriculture and metalworking and so forth had developed much earlier, but now theoretical philosophy is the latest to develop because we now have the leisure to do it and to get accurate knowledge through it, and we choose to do it. So just a little bit from the passage on 17, he makes a surprising argument that says actually, and students never agree with this point, about how easy philosophy really is. "As to the benefit and scale of the subject, I consider this to have been adequately demonstrated, and that its acquisition is much easier than that of other goods, one might be convinced by the following. The fact that without there having been any payment from the people, okay? And philosophers are still not paid very well, so the argument still applies, okay? Despite there not being, but here there was no payment. I mean, now at least, we kind of get enough to get by, but without there having been any payment from the people to those who do philosophy, which might have made them work so intensely hard, they've overtaken the other skills in their accurate results, despite running for a short time. And handing off many of them to those other skills seems to me a sign of how easy philosophy is. And again, the fact that they all resort to it and wish to spend their leisure on it, abandoning everything else, like we all do, philosophy professors, as you may have noticed, we don't have other lives, we just care about teaching you philosophy, okay? Abandoning everything else is no small evidence that their assiduity comes with pleasure, for no one is willing to labor for a long time. In addition, its use is what makes it special most of all. Philosophers require neither tools nor places for their line of work, but wherever in this world of ours we set our mind, it latches onto the truth in the same way on all sides as if it were right there. And then he goes on to talk about the development of philosophy. And after this, he makes a series of arguments that I'll have to rapidly summarize for you. First, general education requires an acquaintance with scientific method and mathematical philosophy, something he also argues in the beginning of On the Parts of Animals. I think this argument is won the day, so we still have, distribution requirements in sciences and mathematics in order to move on to other kinds of studies. He argues also that general education requires the ability to discern the degree of precision that is required in different kinds of demonstrations. So we have a different degree of precision we expect in geometry than we do in political science, and only if you have a general philosophical education can you make that discernment. He argues that not only mathematics but other sciences as well involve demonstrations, and that the principles of mathematics are not even the primary principles, they're actually prior metaphysical principles. And he makes an function argument or an ergon argument that being intelligent and observant is actually the function of the highest virtue of a human being and should be the main human pursuit. Okay, after that rather practical and influential defense of philosophy, then we have a rather more bizarre defense of and conception of philosophy that comes from the Heraclides character. He argues, for example, that our avoidance of becoming insane shows that we actually pursue intelligence and thus we should want to do philosophy. He argues that our unwillingness to be like children or to be drunk for our entire life and the fact that we avoid death indicates that we pursue intelligence and thus should do philosophy. He argues that our desire for property shows that humans desire living well, and that thus the pursuit of intelligence which enables us to live well is desirable. And he argues that, and this is an extraordinary argument that I will read to you at length from page 26, that all other things that people consider valuable, including beauty, honors, and reputation, are worthless, and that our life on earth is like a punishment and torture for past sins, and that nothing valuable belongs to us except the kind of intellect that is cultivated by doing philosophy. So let's look at that argument on page 26. One will discover that all the things that seem great to people are an optical illusion. On this basis, too, it is rightly said that the human creature is nothing, and that nothing is stable in human affairs. For strength, stature, and beauty are a joke and worth nothing. And beauty seems to be like that because what we see isn't accurate. For if someone were able to be as sharp-sighted as they claim Lynceus was, who saw through walls and trees, how could such a sight seem bearable to him, seeing what bad things he's composed of? And honors and reputations, objects of more zeal than the rest of them, are laden with indescribable nonsense, for it is senseless for someone who perceives anything eternal to exert himself for those things. What is long? What endures over time in human affairs? It's actually owing to our weakness, I think, and the shortness of our lifetime that those things appear to be much of anything. So who could think of himself successful and happy looking at these things for which we have all been constructed right at the beginning by nature as if for retribution, all of us, just as they state the mysteries, the mystery religions say to us. For the older ones say this divinely to us by claiming that the soul pays retribution and that we live for the atonement of certain great failings. For the body's conjunction with the soul is very much a thing of this sort. As they claim, the Tyrrhenians often torture their captives by enchaining corpses right up against their living bodies, face to face, fastening each part to each part. Similarly, it is like the soul is stretched out and stuck onto all the sensitive members of the body. So, nothing divine or happy belongs to humans apart from just the one thing that is worth effort, as much insight and intelligence as is in us, for it's the only thing of what's ours that seems to be immortal, and this alone divine. And by being able to share in such a capability, our way of life, although by nature unfortunate and difficult, is yet so gracefully managed that in comparison with the other animals, a human is like a god. For intellect is the god in us, whether it was Hermotimus or Anaxagoras who said so, and this mortal phase has a part of some god. So we should do philosophy, or say goodbye to living and depart from this place, since everything else, at least, is, in a way, like so much trash and nonsense. So again, a very over-the-top, uncompromising view about why you should do philosophy. Next time your parents complain about you doing philosophy, you can actually don't do this, but reading it back to them would probably convince them not to. But it's a beautiful speech, but one that even Aristotle realizes needs to be tempered with some more practical arguments. And so he gives us these practical arguments, and these are basically the last ones I'm going to mention to you. He gives the Aristotle character a teleological argument for doing philosophy, where he says that things come to be either by luck or skill or nature, and unlike what comes to be by luck, what comes to be by skill comes to be for the sake of something, and what comes to be by skill imitates nature, so what comes to be by nature must come to be for the sake of something. Human beings come to be by nature, and thus for the sake of something. What is this something for the sake of which we've come to be? Well, some kind of theoretical activity like thinking. And then Aristotle makes what I call an anti-utilitarian argument, which drives a nail into the coffin of the Isocratean utilitarian concept of philosophy. This is on page 29 to 30, again an extraordinary speech. To seek for every science to produce some other thing and require that it be useful is the demand of someone entirely mistaken about how much things that are good are in principle far apart from things that are necessities. They differ the most. For among the things without which living is impossible, one should say that those that are appreciated on account of some other thing are necessities and joint causes, while all those that are appreciated for themselves, even if no other thing results from them, should be called goods in the strict sense. For this is not valuable because of that, and that for the sake of something else, nor does this get lost by going forward into infinity. Rather, this comes to a halt at some point. So then it is absolutely ludicrous to seek from everything a benefit other than the thing itself, and to ask, where then is the utility for us, and why is this useful? For what we say is truly said, such a fellow doesn't seem to be someone who knows about the beautiful and the good, or someone who can discern between a cause and a joint cause. And one might see that what we say is all the more true if someone transported us in thought, so to speak, to the Isles of the Blessed. Okay, this is sort of like heaven or something. For in that place, there would turn out to be no need of anything, nor any utility in anything else, with only thinking and observing left remaining, which we claim now, too, is a free way of life. If this is true, then surely any one of us would be justly embarrassed if, when the permit was granted to us to be at home in the Isles of the Blessed, he was by his own fault unable to do so. Thus the payment to humans of knowledge is not despicable, and the good that comes from it is no slight good. Just as the poets who are wise claim that in Hades is transported to us the bounty of justice, likely Likewise, in the Isles of the Blessed is the bounty of intelligence, in all likelihood. And so it's not a terrible thing at all, then, if it doesn't appear to be useful or beneficial. For we don't claim that it's beneficial, but that it is itself good. And it is appropriate to choose it for itself, not for the sake of some other thing. Just as we travel abroad to Olympia for the sake, to the Olympics, okay, for the sake of the spectacle itself, even if there is going to be nothing more to gain from it, for the observation itself is superior to lots of money. And just as we observe the Dionysia, okay, that's the theatrical festivals, it's like saying just as we go to the movies or go to a play, not in order to get anything from the actors, instead we actually spend money to see that. And just as there are many other spectacles we would choose instead of lots of money, so the observation of the universe should be honored above everything that is regarded as useful. Surely we must not travel with much effort for the sake of beholding people imitating girls and slaves, or fighting and running, and not think that one must be a spectator of the nature of existing things, i.e. the truth, for free. Okay, and after that, Aristotle makes a political science argument, which also contradicts Isocrates' practical views. He says that political science, just like medicine and gymnastics, requires theoretical knowledge of nature and cannot be a purely kind of empirical science. And then we get the absolutely final concluding arguments. Of course, again, put in the voice of the character Aristotle, just as we value sight even when it produces nothing, so we should value theoretical science even when it produces nothing. Then he makes an argument that says, and this is a very strange argument, very interesting but very strange, that the term living and life applies more to philosophers than any other way of life. So philosophers live more than other people, okay? And philosophers have more fun, enjoyment, and pleasure. True apprehension of the nature of pleasure belongs more to philosophers than to any other way of life. So whether your goal in life is to get more pleasure or virtue or intelligence, one should do philosophy. And that's the final conclusion and the final passage I'll read to you on page 34. The passage on the bottom of page 34, skipping a couple of the first few lines. Well then, we take the position that success is either intelligence and a certain wisdom, or virtue, or having the most enjoyment, or all of the above. Now, if it's intelligence, it's evident that living successfully will belong to the philosophers alone. And if it's virtue of the soul, or enjoyment, even so it will belong to them either alone or most of all. For intelligence is the virtue in us that is most in charge, and it is the most pleasant thing of all by a one-to-one comparison. And similarly, even if someone claimed that success is all of these things together, this is to be determined by being intelligent. Hence, philosophy should be done by everyone who is capable of it, for surely this is what it is to live perfectly well, or else is the cause, most of all anyway, by a one-to-one comparison of its belonging to our souls. And so that is practically the end of it. There's a peroration which brings back in the idea about the divine aspect of doing philosophy, and then the work concludes, thus we should all be doing philosophy. Thank you.
Hi, I was just wondering if there were any strong arguments or people that have made arguments against this sort of argument, and if not, I was wondering what you would say is the most viable argument against this argument.
Well, certainly people have made in antiquity, in the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance, in the early modern period, in the late modern period, in the contemporary period, and today are making arguments against philosophy. And a lot of them are the same arguments. Now, and philosophy has changed a little bit because this is a much broader conception of philosophy that basically includes all theoretical and mathematical disciplines, which were considered philosophical at the time. So the attack on philosophy today utilizes a lot of the same arguments, but may come across as more effective because they're not necessarily arguing against the value of doing mathematical things. So all the encouragement of STEM, right? Science, technology, what's the E stand? Engineering and mathematics, right? These are the things that we give a protreptic to now, and this is what everybody should be doing. And instead of philosophy and humanities and arts, we should all be responsible people and doing this other kind of thing. Well, it wasn't so long ago that the mathematics part of that was considered to just be this kind of philosophical nonsense. Okay, so and that's what we saw, is people saying, hey, what use is this mathematical philosophy going to do us? Now think about how wrong that argument was, okay, to the point that now it's like we should all be doing mathematics instead of philosophy. And it's because, in a way, the protreptic argument saying that mathematical philosophy is good and important won the day, and so won the day that they broke out into autonomous fields and eventually stopped being called philosophy. I mean, when Isaac Newton in the early modern period, the most famous work that he wrote is called Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. And they weren't using the term science and scientist and STEM and that sort of thing at that time. And he thought what he was doing was called natural philosophy, okay? And we now just call it physics or science or something else. And so it obscures the history of it, that these originally were pursued as being philosophy. Okay, so it's a challenging argument. You know, what do I think is most effective argument against philosophy? Well, if it truly was totally worthless and the only defense of it was that it was purely intrinsically valuable or transformed you into something like a god, the kind of claims that, you know, religious cults or something make, then I don't think it would be very effective. But it's the fact that philosophy still is innovating things, coming up with different approaches, different ways to think of things, different ways to prove things, that makes it still, you know, still important and worth doing. So I think we still see a lot of the same arguments, that everything needs to be practical, people need to be able to get jobs from what they're doing. And my dean said to me one time, don't ever mention the argument about the intrinsic value of doing anything to me anymore, okay? Don't ever, I'm tired of hearing that argument. I mean, I was sort of stunned, but it's like, she doesn't want to hear that anymore. I want to hear how this stuff is useful, how it works for people, okay? But so that's what's sort of magical about this document, is that it has both sides of that, both the argument that it's intrinsically valuable, that it's part of what it is to be a human, and it's also practically useful. And that part of it is certainly right, because we now consider mathematical science to be useful and all important. And if we hadn't listened to this, if we had gone with what Isocrates was saying, or gone with what the apotreptic speaker was saying, then we never would have developed these mathematical sciences that it's so important for us to study. And who knows what sciences we won't have in the future if we're dissuaded from doing philosophy. Okay, but thank you. It's an excellent question.
Next question. Grant?
Question. On page 26, where he says, so one should do philosophy or say goodbye to living and depart from this place, and everything else, at least in a way, like so much trash and nonsense.
Yes.
So for people that were like their job wasn't in philosophy, or like this wasn't part of that, it was basically just telling them to kill themselves.
Well, yes. As you can see, this is a very pessimistic view of the world. Okay, and it's not a view that Aristotle actually shares. Aristotle has a very, as it were, optimistic view of the world, that actually we reach our natural good if nothing impedes it, and we can, by getting an education in philosophy, we can become as great as gods and things like this. But this version of defending philosophy, that everything else isn't worth doing at all, okay, this is the kind of thing that gives philosophers a bad press, right? That it looks like they're just geeking out on their own things that have no applicability to anything else, and they're very haughty and think that they're doing the most important things and that they're doing divine-like things while the rest of us are mucking around here, doing practical things, getting real jobs, that sort of thing. So, he's not, it basically is, yes, say goodbye to living and depart from this place. But it actually has a very strange view about what life is in the earlier paragraphs. So he compares life, he says that we have to look at life like the mystery religions tell us. And what they seem to have said is that, look, how did we come into this phase of existence? We're all born into this phase of existence, and we didn't ask to be brought here. We come into this phase of existence. And why? And this conception of why we're here is that we did bad stuff in a past life, or we were ignorant or something, and we've been brought here into this miserable world with so much pain and so much injustice and unfairness. The reason we're here is to be punished for what happened previously. And so this life is not all that happy, and there's not much to be gained from it, says this pessimistic argument. It's actually a miserable, terrible, unfair world. I mean, we're in a nice part of this world where we get to sit here and talk about philosophy on a Friday afternoon and reconstruct lost works of Aristotle, but the world out there is just full of misery and essentially the same thing as torture. And so if you're not going to be doing philosophy and you're not going to get this kind of enlightenment, then your life is going to essentially amount to a series of tortuous things, of pursuing necessities instead of things that are valuable, just trying to survive, just trying to keep alive. And if the only thing there is in life is just trying to survive, just trying to keep alive and not enjoy any of it, then arguably it's not worth it. That's not worthwhile to go on in that condition. But as pessimistic as that is, the assumption of the argument is that, but it's easy to escape that because we can do philosophy. And we don't need special tools to do philosophy, and we don't need to be in special places to do philosophy. All we need is to be able to talk to other people. We need an inhabited world where there are other people we can do philosophy with. And then we will make this miserable, unfair, unjust existence not only bearable, but we will make it as good as possible. We will become like gods because we will concentrate on our intellect and to things that really are intrinsically valuable, and that's what the gods do. So yes, it is, it should be a trigger warning or something here. It is basically saying either do philosophy or go kill yourself, but again, I wouldn't put that on a flyer and make that an advertisement for philosophy majors, but it's a way of looking at the world, okay? That if you don't have a chance to get this kind of education and think about this kind of stuff, then you may find yourself in a world that's just full of so much misery and unfairness that it's not worth it.
Cosmo?
My question kind of takes away, I guess, maybe a little bit from the philosophical aspect, but I'm kind of really curious about like the research process of like reconstructing and like translating like ancient texts, because I'm in a Eastern philosophy class right now, and we're talking about like translating and like figuring out what they were talking about in the like classical Chinese texts, and how like the language wasn't really like standardized by that time period. And so I was kind of wondering if there was any like, I don't know, interesting stuff about like, I mean, I'm sure there's interesting stuff, but like what do you think would be like some of the interesting points about this type of like research and reconstructing, like particularly when it pertains to like Western texts?
Well, yes, and first of all, I'm very interested in Eastern texts, and in the case of ancient Eastern texts like of Confucianism or Taoism in the Chinese tradition, or Buddhist and Hindu texts in Sanskrit or Pali traditions and things like that, a lot of the same issues arise. So lost works. The rule is basically lost works, okay? Works of Greek literature in their entirety, we estimate that what has survived is about 1% or less than the total works that were produced, okay? And essentially the same thing in Chinese, roughly in Chinese and Indian traditions. What has survived the various catastrophes of the millennia between us now and them is something like 1% of this stuff got through. So Chinese philologists are confronted with the same problem. Incomplete texts, lost texts, later texts that might be hostile. We had to reconstruct views out of looking at the criticisms of those views in other texts that for some reason survived when the other ones didn't. So they confront exactly the same kinds of problems, and but one thing that's interesting is there is not, as of now, a shared agreement about the processes for recovering, reconstructing these texts, and even creating critical editions of these texts. So we have pretty much followed a very, very traditional kind of philological methodology of examining what we call cover texts, later texts by later authors who possess the earlier works, and then performing a kind of source critical study of them to differentiate what they're saying versus what the source text said, and then taking that material and looking for parallels to it in surviving works, and looking at other works that were similar in nature, and then reconstructing on the basis of what these probably look like. And this whole thing is very hypothetical and quite controversial. So other scholars have argued that the work wasn't a dialogue, for example, that it was a monologue speech that just contained Aristotle's arguments for why you should do philosophy. And we disagree with that because in the evidence base that we can establish, we find adversarial speeches like you do in a dialogue. We find people arguing against doing philosophy, an indirect speech. Not an indirect speech like their views are being described, but in direct speech saying you shouldn't do philosophy. And then we have other people answering those. And we also have views that cannot, for example, be Aristotle's. So Aristotle's view of the soul is not that it's like a corpse strapped on to a soul at all. And so that can't be Aristotle himself talking. It has to be somebody else. So we have ventured to go back to an older conception that it was a dialogue. You had speakers, there was a dramatic setting, they were probably arguing in front of a group of youths, but that's controversial, okay? And whether these papyrus texts should be attributed to this text or should be attributed to some other text, that's all very controversial. But we've used very traditional sort of Western methods in reconstructing these, and those are not necessarily employed in the reconstruction of lost Chinese or Sanskrit texts. And in general, we don't have the same kind of critical editions and complete surveys of manuscripts in these other traditions. And so in a way, I think this is a big future project for philosophers and people like you to get into this and start applying these methods and trying this with ancient Chinese texts, with ancient Indian texts, and figuring out what those arguments were. And once we get solid versions of those texts, comparing them with the other traditions and seeing how similar, and especially what's even more interesting, how different the views are. Okay, so the same evidentiary situation applies. Because of the development of history of scholarship is different in these different regions, different methods are used. Same problems, different methods, but we need to be working together with people that learn learn these languages and can compare these ideas. And so my own work is going in the direction of looking more into Chinese philosophy, Indian philosophy, trying to compare it. And I really think it's the future of the history of philosophy is to compare ancient traditions and not just exclusively focus on like the Greco-Roman one. And so I just got back from China, actually, giving some talks about this work in Shanghai. And there are some scholars in Shanghai at Fudan University in their classics department that are going to translate our reconstruction of the Protrepticus, and they are translating not from our English translation, but from the Greek text that we've identified in the order that we're putting them, and then they will translate our transitional comments. And so that's a kind of cooperative, transnational effort to revive this text, and that's the kind of thing we need a lot more of. And so I can only offer you a protreptic, as it were, an exhortation to doing that kind of work. And it's difficult, but it's fascinating, you know. So I'm really happy to hear that you're doing that.
Yeah, it sounded super interesting. I was like, I don't know, thinking about the kind of way ideas can be communicated across the time and languages, like, because we've talked a lot about translations and like how do you kind of convey a concept that was kind of relevant in a particular time period and had like a specific understanding in that area, and kind of translate it into another cultural context in a whole different time period. And like seeing that you're kind of working on that, I think that's like a super interesting.
Yes, well, absolutely. So translations are interpretation. I mean, a translation is an interpretation, and we could be translating, we're still working on the translation because there's different ways that the Greek might be interpreted. And the thing is that if you really want to understand what's going on with these texts, you can't depend on translations, because then you're depending on other people's interpretations and not forming your own. So if you really want to get into those Chinese texts, there's no way to escape studying literary ancient Chinese in graduate school or wherever you would end up pursuing this. In the meantime, we depend on translators, and they spend a lot of effort trying to get the things right. And so there's even Greek texts, which we have millennia of experience of translating them into modern languages, or hundreds of years of experience doing this. There's still a lot of controversy. Now that is taken to a different order of magnitude when we talk about translating into English a Chinese text or a Sanskrit text, especially a Chinese text, because it's a totally different language family. In the case of Sanskrit, we're in the Indo-European language family. Chinese texts were in a totally different language family with a different syntax, a different semantics, and everything has to be taken into account. So that's an even more difficult and, in fact, sort of mind-boggling problem that we need more work. And that kind of work really, we've sort of just started doing that in the history of philosophy. So it's, like I say, I think it's the future of the history of philosophy, so I can only encourage it.
I think we have time for one, maybe two questions. Oh, Carolyn.
I'll make mine short. I'm interested in how we should interpret this on page 29, the part where he says, nor does this get lost in going forward to infinity, rather this comes to a halt at some point. I just wondered if you could give a little more. So like it sounds like that's referring to the goods, this idea that there's like these kind of pure philosophical goods, and there's these like mixed goods that are like not as good. And it sounded like the infinity was talking about the impurity, like somehow that's not going to go to infinity. Like that comes to a stop. But I was wondering how should we interpret that?
Well, actually, that's a very interesting thought, and that kind of interpretation hadn't occurred to me, so I need to give that more thought. We were interpreting it as basically a sort of infinite regression argument, that if everything has to have some further use, then nothing really ends up being good in itself, and so there's no reason for action. We have to stop the process of saying why something is good at some point where we arrive at a final good, and then we can act. So if you ask me why I got out of bed this morning, and well, because I wanted to give this talk. Why did I want to give this talk? Well, I didn't want to disappoint my colleagues. Why didn't I want to disappoint my colleagues? Well, I want to keep my job and my career. Well, why do you want to keep your job and career? Well, because I need to earn money in order to live. Well, why do you want to earn money in order to live? Well, and then I eventually get to some good, like, well, I want to be happy, right? I want to be successful in life. And you can't then keep asking the question, why do you want to be successful in life? Why do you want to be happy? If this doesn't stop somewhere, and there's just an infinite series of usefulness and goods, then there's no reason to begin. There's no reason to get out of bed in the morning. If I couldn't establish that this chain of ends, chain of good things ends somewhere, then action is basically irrational. It goes on to infinity. It regresses to infinity. But in fact, we can find things that are good in and of themselves. We can find what we, in fancy terms, call intrinsic goods. Things like, well, pleasure is an intrinsic good. You don't need more reasons to enjoy things. That's its own reason. And we don't really need reasons why we should be virtuous, like why we should be fair, why we should be just. Those are reasons. Those are goods. And if somebody's obtuse if they say, well, why do you want to be just? What's the point in being a good person? What's the point in being a fair or a virtuous person? And we also don't need further reasons why we should be intelligent or stimulate our minds. That just is a good. And so that's the point of the argument, is that the person who insists that everything has to be useful, like Isocrates does, if it's not useful, I'm not going to do it, doesn't realize that even the usefulness that they're after has to come to an end in some kind of final good. And so don't keep saying, why is it useful? Why is it useful? Realize that some things are ends, and then I can show you why the activity is related to those. And that's why we call them ends, because they end the infinite regression process of reasons for acting. Okay, so I think that's what the argument's about, but I'm going to explore further this other interpretation, because it actually could relate to their mathematical conceptions of infinity and other things like that. So thanks.
I'm afraid we will have to end it there. Please join me in thanking our speakers.
Thank you.